As Jim said, thank you for taking time out of your afternoon, out of your day to come and listen to what we have to say. We're kind of right. This is the midpoint of the meetings. We've cut back to 8 meetings this round. Before we had been doing 9, and the third meeting in Brewster was just didn't get a lot of attendance there, so we decided to try and cut it back 1. We'll see how that works out. So far, the attendance has been very good at all of our meetings. So kind of an indication, I think, that there's a lot of interest right now in marketing and possibly a fair amount of grain out there yet to be priced. Tomorrow we go west with meetings in Garrettson, South Dakota and Laverne. And then on Thursday we wrap things up by going east to some of our new customers in the Jackson and all the way over to the Blue Earth area. And we have a lot of fun putting these things on. It's good to get some face-to-face time with you folks and share what's going on in the marketplace. So today, here's what we're going to talk about. Normally when we have these mid-January meetings, there's a couple of focal points, and the number one is always the final crop production report and the quarterly grain stocks report as of December 1st. And of course, supply and demand tables are also updated. Well, unfortunately, the reports for the 11th, last Friday, were postponed due to the government shutdown. So what we'll do today, we'll go back to that last USDA supply and demand report in December 11th to kind of keep the perspective of what to be watching. We'll also look at the trade estimates for each area of the report that should have come out last Friday, because really that's probably what's being traded in the marketplace right now without having government numbers to work with. We'll also talk quite a bit about the global situation right now. Of course, we have the ongoing trade war with the U.S. and China, and this is one of those things where one day everything is great, prices are going to be strong, the world's coming up in roses, and the next day it's all dandelions and ready to be plowed under. Today is one of those days. What we had come out about mid-session this morning were comments from Leitzner, one of the lead trade reps on the U.S.-China negotiations, and came out and basically said there's no progress being made. This was following 3 days worth of meetings last week, where at the end of the meetings all the comments were good, saying the progress is very positive, we're making strides, President of China is coming to Washington yet this month, and we hope to have an agreement. So now the market is left with indecision. That's why corn's down 6 to 7 right now and beans are down 10. Tomorrow, this all might change. So the global situation is very important. We're also going to talk about China and what's going on with their swine fever outbreak. This is potentially a very significant thing in the soy and protein complex as we go forward, because basically it's going to result in a reduction in demand, and that's demand not only for our soybeans, but soybeans out of South America, and all of a sudden we have this situation where as they slow down their demand, it's probably going to take a little bit of time before the world realizes that we need to slow down production. So we're left with a kind of a precarious situation on soybeans. We'll also look at corn and soybean production estimates now out of South America. At our last meeting in November, there was a lot of talk about how big this crop in Brazil was going to be. They just raised a record soybean crop last year, and there was a lot of talk that this crop would be even bigger. It was just how big was it going to get? Well, you know, it's kind of funny. The good Lord looks down, and he's smarter than what we are. And if we say we got too much, we complain about surpluses, he can fix that, right? Just throws a little bit of weather into South America, and that crop shrinks down a little bit. We'll talk about those estimates here today. A little bit on weather. We are still in a mild El Nino. Part of the reason why we've had a very nice winter so far. Anybody like this January weather? Well, it's going to change. You know, it's Minnesota, so just give it until Saturday when we may not get above 0. But what's that? April? Yeah. But the good thing about these outbreaks this winter, you know, we've had a couple of them. How long do they last? You know, a day or two. And that's a lot better than those pipe busting ones that go for 7 to 10 days and doesn't get above 0. We'll look at information from Commodity Weather Group that looks at the weather pattern we've had so far this year, and as we ended 2018, what might that mean as we get into the spring and summer of 2019 and our new growing season. We'll look at corn and soybean price outlook both for old and new crop, talk a little bit about some grain marketing opportunities, and your questions and comments are always welcome. Please don't be shy or bashful. If you have something you want to have covered or not clear, bring it up, because there's probably somebody sitting next to you thinking about the same question. Just a Press release of what the government said as far as delaying the reports. Now this is an interesting situation we're in right now. I think what is it, day 25? So for the last 25 days, it's not just the report on the 11th that we're missing. There's daily and weekly reports on export sales, on ethanol usage, a lot of things like that that should be reported by the government that right now are being missed. And I was reminded of this by an article that somebody sent me last night, and this is a little bit before my time in the industry. It happened in 1972. I was still in high school then. But in 1972, we were in a trade spat with who? Russia. Bingo. And what happened in 1972? By the way, in 1972, we did not have the USDA reporting weekly and daily export sales above a certain amount. That came out of the Russian trade war, by the way. That was what I was reminded of last night. Because what happened then is we were in a trade war with Russia. Everybody thought we would never trade with them. We would never sell them any grain. We'd have big surpluses. Prices were low. And what did Russia quietly do behind the scenes? Does anybody remember?
They bought all the wheat.
They bought all the grain. They bought roughly 10 million metric ton of grain, and since it wasn't reported, the market didn't know until we came to a stocks report later and found out that the bins were what? Empty. And all of this grain had been bought at low prices, and then what happened to the prices? They skyrocketed. Now, I'm not saying it's happening right now, but far be it from China to try something like this, right? Right now, nothing's being reported. So where we say, gosh, we're disappointed, the market's going down because they're not buying corn, they're not buying beans, they might be, but it's not being reported to the marketplace.
They're not that clever, are they?
Chinese? They're the shrewdest traders in the world, I think. Yes?
Really? Is there any indication that when the government does reopen, how are they going to do these reports?
Excellent question.
Start over again? Or?
What they've said or what the trade anticipates, keep in mind now, most of these people have not been in the office for 25 days. And that goes way before the report release date of the 11th. So basically nothing was done in preparation of that report. So the trade believes it will take the USDA 10 to 14 working days after Washington comes back to work to get the report ready. So, you know, these guys in Washington, they work hard, right? I can't jab the Vikings because the season's over, so I'm going to go after Washington today, okay? We just had a holiday and a New Year's, so they had vacation, right? But now they can't work this week because they need to recess. The government shut down, and they take a week off from work. How does that work? You know, we couldn't do that. But so basically what I'm saying, or what I've been told, there will be nothing done this week because they don't come back to work until the 21st. And let's say, for instance, they come in and everybody holds hands and they work out a deal. 10 days from the 21st puts us into February, doesn't it? So I think there's a good chance we will not see this final crop production report until sometime in February, or who knows? I mean, President Trump says this thing can go on for months. At some point, this final crop production report has to be released. See, this happened once before, what was it, 2012 or something, where the government was shut down for a while during October, right over the October crop report, and they basically missed that report and never brought it back in. But a final report like this will have to be released at some point in time. There's a possibility if they get this thing settled late enough, maybe they all come out in the February reports, which would be what, 10th or 11th of February. Maybe they just do everything then. Right now, we don't know when.
Do you think they're going to recount the numbers or just
No.
what they had?
Well, I don't think they had them yet. So you see, if Washington's not open, the state representatives that go there in a lockup session to put this report together, that hasn't happened. So I think they basically will start from scratch, but the numbers shouldn't change, okay?
But some of these numbers will, like...
Oh yeah, supply and demand. Yeah, supply and demand will. You know, and that's what makes it kind of tough because until we get the final production numbers and the grain stock numbers, the supply and demand numbers may not be accurate either. So we'll just have to kind of wait and see. Just a rule of thumb, keep about 10 to 14 days, 2 weeks after they come back to work that we may get an announcement of when the report's going to be. Doesn't mean it's going to be 2 weeks after. The other thing maybe to keep in mind, you know, I seen a piece at the news on the news last night, and you know, they're really trying to anti-administration, so everybody in the country is hurting because of this shutdown, which I won't argue with. But of course, they had farmers from all over the country complaining about the fact they can't get their disaster money, they can't get their trade reimbursement. And I think if you haven't heard already, once, you know, the sign-up period for the trade adjusting payment was supposed to be January 15th. Now for every day the government is shut down, that sign-up period will be extended by that number of days. That took Washington a long time to decide. You know, but that part we do know. We don't know how many days will be extended. So these will come out, but we don't know for sure when. So let's go through the private ones and see what the trade is thinking. We'll start out with crop production, and on the bottom of this screen, you'll see the 2017-18 final crop. These were the crop numbers that were released for the 2017 crop. So a corn yield a year ago, 176.6. We remember in November, the USDA raised that number way up, 178.9, which would be an all-time record for corn yield in the United States. I said in November, and I'll say again today, I think the USDA is too high with that number. We just did not have a good general crop conditions in the U.S. this year. Too many problem areas to have a record-type crop. I'm not saying it was a bad crop, but I don't think it was, you know, 2.3 bushel higher than a year ago. What is the trade thinking? Well, the average guess was about 176.7 to 179.9, or an average of 178. So the trade is believing that the USDA will come down slightly in this corn yield around a bushel per acre when we finally do get that report. On soybeans last year, 49.3. In November, 52.1, another all-time record for the United States. And the range of the trade right now, about 51.5 to 52.5, or an average of 51.8. So on the soybean side too, looking for a little bit smaller yield. We don't know if they'll do anything with harvested acres, but we do kind of get the sense that there were some acres probably damaged or lost. If you remember, we didn't have a very nice fall in a lot of parts in the country. And along the Delta states, we had a number of hurricanes that damaged tobacco, cotton, and soybeans. In Kansas, I have some friends that have farms down there that they planted some soybeans, and they said there's areas of Kansas where it got too wet this fall, and 50% of the soybeans never got harvested. So we know in Minnesota that if we leave beans out through the winter, they usually don't turn out so well by spring, right? Probably some lost production. So this could be a little bit of what the market's thinking about right now. Another thing on the production, and I got to be honest with you, I really believe that the corn yield is lower than 178. I think 178.9 is high. I think 178 is too high. And this is one reason why. This is a map put out by CONUS and NOAA, which are a couple of government agencies. And this map shows the difference in moisture received in 2018 versus the previous record. Follow me there? And this goes back like 40 years. So these areas, as these colors get darker, these dark oranges and reds, the darkest colors there were areas that received more than 20 inches of rain above their previous annual record. Meaning that some of these areas received over 40 inches of rain during 2018. Now that makes a record corn crop, right? And look at the area that's affected. You're talking almost 25% of Iowa, the #1 corn state in the country. You're talking southwest, south central, and southeast Minnesota. By the way, this didn't affect us, did it? Any farmers here from the Jackson area? We were over, last time when we were over in Blue Earth in November at these meetings, that's some high-powered land over there, guys. Not that ours is bad, but they can really raise stuff. When we had 225 a year ago, they had 260. And last year they harvested a lot of corn at 125 to 140. this in 2018. That's a big part of Minnesota. This is a big part of Iowa. You see northern Illinois was infected. You see southern Ohio was affected, and even parts of Nebraska. So I just have a hard time believing the crop was that good nationwide. And if you were at our last meeting, you remember I talked a little bit about a new friend that I had met by phone, Johnny Mack. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about Johnny Mack. And we'll start out by saying that after he talked to me, in fact, when he was talking to me about the corn yield in the U.S., and to put a little background to people who weren't familiar with him, Johnny Mack is, I think he's probably in his early 70s. For almost 30 years, he's religiously tracked corn yields in the United States. And he takes the data from every seed corn company and every one of their seed test plots and puts this into his spreadsheet to figure out what the yield should be based compared to the USDA. And the guy does it all by hand. The last time I talked to him, he said, Dan, if you don't believe me, come and meet me at the airport. I'll bring my books and show you.
Where are you from?
That's a good question. I think he lives in Chicago now, but he's married to a gal from France who 10 years ago was told she had literally less than months to live. And she said, if that's what I'm dealt with, I'm fine, but we're going back to France and I'll die there. That was 10 years ago and she's still alive. So, that's about as much I know. What I do know about John, he works for Rand Financial. He's an introducing broker. And when I see Rand Financial come up on my caller ID, I just tell everybody in the office, don't bother me for 40 minutes, because that's how long he'll talk. And I don't get to talk. I just listen. He'll go through every state and say, this is what I found, this is what the USDA said, here's the difference. Well, he's drastically lower than the USDA, partly because of some of these reasons. And what he's saying, his yield, he said the government's not going to show this, but his yield is under 170. Now, to be defense, he's not just a guy who cries wolf every year and says the USDA is wrong because they're too high. Because a year ago, when the USDA was 176.6, do you know what John told the USDA? You are too low. And he was convinced that based on his data, once again, that he had gathered from seed corn companies, that the yield should have been 178 to 179 a year ago. Now, here's how this plays out, because this is important to keep in mind, and I hope I don't lose you here. When the USDA understates a crop like they probably did in 2017, how do they find out if they're right or wrong? They have these quarterly grain stocks report, right, to measure what's in the bin. So if they underestimate the 2017 crop and they come to the grain stocks reports in 2018, what did they find? More or less corn than what they thought they had? More. And what did it do to prices? Took it down, and what did they blame it on? Feed residual. They said, we aren't feeding as much. Okay? So then what do? They said, well, we don't understand why, because livestock numbers are up. We just must be more efficient. So what do they do with the feed residual number for 2019? They bring it down because it was overstated in 2018. But it was probably because the crop was underestimated. Now, this year, if they're wrong this way and they're overestimating the crop, what are they going to find in future stock reports? That the corn is not there. And what are they going to do? We underestimated feed residual. They don't admit that they made a mistake on the crop because they think their model is perfect. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I'm saying it's very possible that it could and did. And I put this up just as a reminder to talk about Johnny Mack. He's a photographer by his first love. After he called me the first time and introduced himself, he said, oh, by the way, he said, I'm on the way to the airport. I'm going to India for 3 weeks. I said, what are you going to do in India? He said, I'm going to take pictures. My hobby is photography. And then he brings these pictures back, and he's having a photography expo in Chicago. That's why I think he's probably from Chicago. Sometimes we talk about boring and meaningless jobs. Do you know what this is? This is a factory in India where they make rose oil. Now, I've heard of rose oil before. I think it's used in different things. These ladies are sorting rose petals. Now, what kind of rewarding job would that be? And probably getting paid, what, $1.25 a day or something? I don't know. Anyway, Johnny Mac lives on, convinced that the crop is too high. Oh, and by the way, he doesn't just say that to people. He's prepared a white paper to send to the USDA to tell them how wrong they are. And he's also convinced they will probably throw it away. But he really believes that the corn crop still rated too high. Okay, grain stocks. Another report that was supposed to come out last Friday. Just a couple of things to look at to kind of set a perspective for ourselves. On the corn stocks from a year ago, on December 1st, 12.567 billion bushel of corn on hand. This 17 behind it means that was an all-time record corn stocks numbers for the USDA as of December 1st. What is happening to the corn stocks as we go from last December 1st to this December 1st in the eyes of the marketplace? Which direction is it going? Down by about 500 million bushels. And as stocks get lower, what should happen to prices? They should go up. Is Jim here? Nah, he's looking for the projector, I think. Now, if Jim was here, I would ask the question, and he would say, based on last year when we did these meetings to this year, corn is up 30 cents. Now, I didn't say it was a good price, but the corn price is 30 cents higher than it was a year ago. Okay? That should happen as stocks get smaller, carryout comes down. Now, what about soybeans? 3.161 billion bushel, also an all-time record last year on December 1st. Is there any difference in the trend of stocks on corn that's going down or beans that, whoa, is that right? Soybean stocks 600 million bushel higher than a year ago? What should that mean to price? I guess the market doesn't know because we're not that much lower, but there's some risk in this situation because, and can we justify it? What caused this? What happened in the last year? China. We lost our number one customer and didn't export a bean to them from basically the 1st of May until I think we loaded our first boat for them last week. That's a big deal.
Well, they're getting the beans.
Brazil.
Brazil?
Yeah, I could show you a chart that it's just literally bushel for bushel. Brazil, remember, had a record crop last year, so they had beans to sell. Now they've pretty much run themselves out of inventory, but they're starting to harvest already. So that's what happened.
Well, I heard there's some ships, how they do that. They don't know where the destination is.
Yeah.
They change it while they're on the trip. They change it.
That didn't happen. Didn't happen here.
Okay.
Now the U.S. did have bean exports that went to Argentina. Argentina imported U.S. beans and crushed the meal and then sold that out. But I really don't think we had U.S. beans redirected to China. The Chinese government was watching this, and literally if it would have happened when it got to the port in China, they would have refused it and it would have had to be redirected elsewhere. In fact, that happened, I think, with some vessels just during the transition of when the trade war kind of picked up speed. So they found beans elsewhere. We'll talk a little bit more about why that transition was a little bit easier for them this year than maybe what it could have been a year ago. So then we get to ending stocks. The ending stocks that we talk about, this is what's left over on August 31st at the end of the crop year. So this is what's projected to be left over on August 31st, 2019. In the December S&D report, the USDA had 1.78 billion bushel. See, we're down below 2 billion now. That's good, and that's why prices are a little bit higher. The trade right now thinks we've lost a little bit, maybe down to 1.69, so 1.7 and change, it's all right, it's going in the right direction. What about soybeans? 955 in December. Now the trade's thinking about 900, so a reduction of around 50 million bushel. What's changed from when the numbers for the December report were put together until now? We've made progress settling what? Settling things with China. And since the numbers were put together here, China's bought around 200 million bushel of U.S. soybeans. But the problem is it's so late in the year that we don't know for sure when they're going to go out, if they're going to go out, and if this is going to happen or not. I read an article last night that said, you know, the trade's thinking 900 million, but if we look at how our exports compare right now today versus a year ago, we are 385 million bushel behind. And most of that's China. So we say, but you just said China bought 200 million. But let's figure it out, guys. 385 less 200, that doesn't catch us up, does it? So the article I read last night said because of that, if China doesn't come in and be a very aggressive buyer of beans in the next 6 months here, there's a good chance that this number, rather than comes down, goes closer to 1 billion bushel by August 31st. So we have to be very careful on soybeans is probably the message there. Here's a supply and demand table from December for corn. Just highlight the changes and what you need to watch when we do finally get the next report. In December, the USDA lowered corn imports by 5 million. They lowered ethanol usage of corn by 50 million. So we lost 50 million of demand, lost 5 million of supply. That involved a carryout increase of 45 million bushel to 1.781. Now, the things you watch in these reports down the road, really 3 categories. Your feed residual, which is almost always just adjusted after quarterly stocks report. So if and when we get this December stocks report, that may be adjusted. Watch your ethanol for corn and your exports. Those 3 areas are really what you need to watch. And then, of course, your ending stocks. The average price was left unchanged at $360 for this crop year, so $360 cash corn's the average price. What they did is raise the bottom end a nickel, brought the top down a nickel. We'll talk more about that later. From a perspective of ending stocks of U.S. corn, we continue the trend now that this would be the 3rd consecutive year where ending stocks of corn are going down. And now, Jim, I'll ask you the question, how does the price compare this year to last year?
Corn price is currently running about 30 cents a bushel higher than a year.
Isn't that amazing? I read his mind and he wasn't even in the room. That's impressive, isn't it? Now he's been asked that same question. This would be the 4th time, so that's how I knew. Yeah. Okay, soybeans in the December crop report, absolutely no changes. Now, what areas do you watch in soybeans? Only 2 here: crush and exports. Remember, going back to that November crop report where the USDA made a huge adjustment. I think it was 165 million bushel reduction in bean exports in 1 month. And that really, kind of put a dagger in the bean market for a short time. So crush and exports. Now, just today, this morning, we had the crush report come out for the month of December. An all-time record for December, for any December. And about 4 million bushel higher than the November crush. So we're still crushing beans at a very good pace. That's good demand to use up soybeans. But unfortunately, the big thing that we have to watch is on exports. And right now, that's left unchanged at 1.9 billion. When we look at the historical perspective of soybean stocks, remember, corn's been coming down now. This would be the 3rd year. Prices are working higher. This looks like it must be a mistake, doesn't it? Where corn ending stocks are going from 400 million to 950 to possibly 1 billion. But when we stop and look at that, last year, the Chinese imported, I think, around 23 million metric ton of soybeans out of the U.S. This year, with what they've bought since our semi-settlement here a few weeks ago, they bought about 8 million. So we've lost about 15 million metric ton of business to China, and that's pretty much what this would amount to. Is it a big deal? Yes, sir, it is. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about exports, both on corn and beans. How are we doing? Are we price competitive? And what do we look for down the road? Now, once again, this is an inspection report that normally is monitored by the government. And when the government's shut down, that means for the last 2 to 3 weeks, we don't know if these numbers are right, do we? If they're all getting reported or not. So we take take it what the trade is trying to estimate them to be. This is updated through yesterday. These inspection reports come out each Monday morning. So for our last 10 weeks on corn, we've averaged 37.3 million bushel of corn loaded out each week. Not a bad number. But we have 33 weeks to go from now until August 31st, the end of the crop year. Based on the current USDA projection of 2.45 billion bushel of corn exports, we need to now average 51 million per week for each and every week of those 33 weeks to reach this number. And for the last 10, we've been doing 37. In other words, we need to watch very closely. We need to see the pace of corn inspections increase dramatically in the coming months, or we run the risk of not reaching this number. And if we don't reach that number, carryout could possibly grow a little bit higher on corn. Soybeans, 35.6 million for the last 10 weeks. That's an impressive number because what was absent in those last 10 weeks? China. So this is other than China purchases. But I'll also tell you that a year ago, we had weeks of inspections that were between 90 and 100 million with China. So that's where our stocks were able to grow the way they did this year. It wasn't that our crop was that big, it was our demand was cut back that much. So now through the next 33 weeks on soybeans, we need to average 37.1 million. Well, it doesn't look like we're too far away, but South America and especially Brazil is now starting to harvest, and we'll have beans in exportable position in the near future. So it's going to get to be tougher for the U.S. to be competitive on beans. Follow me there? Little different way to look at it. Here's our corn inspections. This is the current year right here in this color. The blue is last year, and the silver is 5-year average. Last week was really a concern to the marketplace because our corn inspections were only like 19 million. Some feel that could be because of the holidays. Some feel it could be because of misreporting. But yesterday's number bounced back up. We need to try and keep this number above last year to reach the objective. And remember, we have to be at 51 million right across this line for the rest of the year. And we did that a year ago. So it's possible. A lot of it will depend on world demand and what's going on with the Brazilian corn crop, their second corn crop called the safrinha crop, which is yet to be planted. So we don't know what the weather's going to be like there. And on soybeans, we can see, without China, a big difference from a year ago. Still respectable, but without China, it bears watching. Now we can see here as we go forward, once we get to about this time of the year, typically the U.S. soybean exports will drop off because that's when Brazil and Argentina have beans available and take that market away from us in a large degree. We'll have to wait and see what happens this year.
Dan,
Yes?
since the government shut down, who produces those numbers?
Private estimates, some of the grain companies that are actually loading the stuff out, you could probably get information from them, but we don't know if it's complete. The one thing that we do know, now this is inspections, so this stuff is loaded, and we probably have a little better handle on this because a lot of these boats that are loaded have to be federally inspected to meet specs when they get across the water. So this may be a situation where they might be fairly accurate on the inspections. What we don't know is the export sales, which are reported each Thursday. And if the government's working, any sale of over 100,000 bushel has to be reported on a weekly basis to avoid market disruption. When the government's not working, none of those sales are being reported. So if we wanted to try and track that on our own, what we probably have to watch for is sharp increases in, say, basis levels. So if Cargill is selling a lot of beans to China or something, eventually Cargill would have to start bidding up for beans to source them, right? And we haven't seen that yet, so I think people are comfortable maybe that's not happening to a degree that would really affect the marketplace. Here's the price of world FOB corn. What this means, if you're a buyer of corn anywhere in the world, these would be the markets that you'd look at. The U.S. Gulf in blue, USP&W, Brazil, Argentina, and the Ukraine. That's basically your sources of corn in the world. And we look here at this blue line. This is the U.S. Gulf. So the U.S. Gulf corn is what? Cheapest corn in the world. We should be making more sales. Now, if you're a feed grain buyer, you have livestock in another country and you need to feed them something. Are you going to feed them barley, feed wheat, or corn? And you see, not only is the U.S. the cheapest corn in the world, the U.S. corn is the cheapest feed grain in the world. And this is why people are a little bit concerned. You know, we should be averaging 51 million or more a week on corn because we're the cheapest in the world, but we're not quite seeing the demand yet. Hopefully this kicks in, but a lot will depend on what happens in South America. What about beans? Some interesting things here on the World FOB bean chart. Here we're just going to compare the U.S. Gulf and P&W markets, that would be the West Coast, and then Brazil and Argentina. And you can see the U.S. Gulf, when we reached about May here, that's when confirmation came, when President Trump said we're putting these 25% tariffs on 200 million products to China, and China retaliated and said, fine, we'll live with that, but we're putting 25% tariffs on U.S. soybeans, and by the way, we're not going to buy any. And when that happened, of course, the U.S. market crashed because we had to offset the tariff to make it competitive with China, and this resulted in an opportunity for a lot of the world markets. So if we weren't in a trade war with the country, it was a godsend for them because they were able to buy U.S. beans cheap. And when China said, we're not going to buy the U.S., but we know they need the beans, and all of a sudden Brazil and Argentina, now Argentina had a drought, so they didn't really have a lot of beans to sell, but Brazil had raised a record crop, and they said, hey, if they're going to come to us regardless, what are we going to do with our basis? And they became very expensive. And China wouldn't buy the cheap U.S. beans because of the trade war, but they paid through the nose, at times $1.20 to $1.50 more for beans out of Brazil just 'cause. Right? That's politics at its best, right? Now what do we see happening? Progress being made, at least in the belief of the marketplace, that we're going to get things worked out with China, and U.S. beans start to rally because we start making a few sales to China. Brazil doesn't want to lose the market, so as the U.S. becomes more competitive, they have to bring their prices down now to continue to make sales because they're on the doorsteps of what? Harvest. So right now, today, when you ask about the competitiveness of U.S. beans, we're competitive today, but if Brazil is harvesting another 115 to 120 million metric ton crop, trust me, they are going to price themselves at whatever it takes, right? So it doesn't mean the U.S. loses all the sales, but it gets tougher. Now, once again, not that we would accuse China of doing something like this, but what if China says in good faith, we want to settle things with the U.S., it's causing a lot of problems in our country, which I believe it is. We want to settle with the U.S., and because of that, we are going to commit to buying American corn, beans, crude oil, and ethanol. And they kind of indicated that after those meetings a week ago. And they tell Brazil, you know, we used you last year, but we're going to build some goodwill with the U.S., so we're going to buy U.S. beans. U.S. beans, we have the beans to sell, right? If that were to happen, what would happen to the price of beans in Brazil? Tank. What would happen to farmer profitability in Brazil? Tank. But the beans are still there, right? And then China could step in and say, well, you know, we don't want the U.S. beans, we'll take the lower price. They wouldn't do that, would they? Never done that before. So a lot of things going on in this market, but right now, today, you know, and when you look at this, China's not hurting themselves by buying 8 million metric ton of beans over the last few weeks as a goodwill gesture toward America because we're competitive right now. And if they happen to take the tariff off, take the 25% tariff off, I really think there's some quality advantages that there are crushers in China that would step in and buy U.S. beans. don't adjust your glasses. Your bifocals aren't going bad. I apologize that this is a little fuzzy, but I really like this chart. It came out of a government report, and it was one of those things that it was about 1 inch by 2 inch chart in an article. And when I tried to blow it up, it got a little bit fuzzy. But hopefully, you can follow through what I'm going to show you here. This looks at monthly export of U.S. beans, and it also looks at the world. So here, way on your left, these blue lines are world soybean demand for 2017. And right next to that, it's China demand in 2017. See, a large part of the world demand, 60%, is China. And then we go to 2018 in the green, world demand, and the purple is China demand. And what do you notice about the differences in those 2 years? World demand is what? Lower. China demand is lower, and not just from the U.S. Now, the majority of it did come out of the U.S., but the fact of the matter is China was using less soybeans as we went through 2018, even before the trade war started. In fact, just yesterday I seen numbers where we thought that they had imported around 94 million metric ton of soybeans. Chinese government is saying right now that it was 83.7. You say, well, what does that mean? 10 million metric ton is about 390 million bushel of soybeans. Funny thing, that's a good portion of what our carryout went up, isn't it? So, a lot of things going on in China. A little different perspective. This looks at U.S. soybean exports and compares the 2 years. Here's 2017 on top. 39.5 million metric ton of soybeans out of the U.S. total exports. You can see here some of the other customers, the European Union, Mexico, and China. And then we go down to 2018. See why our carryout went up the way it did? Look at the difference in 1 year. Now, we picked a little business up from other countries. We picked a little business up from the European Union, a little more from Mexico, but nothing that could offset the reduction in that bean program to China. And as that program went down, our ending stocks of beans in the U.S. went from here to here. I guess it's pretty important, isn't it? Ethanol. In our December report, the USDA lowered ethanol usage 50 million bushel. Why did they do that? Anybody want to guess? What was going on in the ethanol industry a month ago? Prices were too cheap. Crude oil was crashing. Christmas Eve day, December 24th, crude oil traded at $42 a barrel. Price of ethanol tends to go down as petroleum goes down. Ethanol plants at that time were losing anywhere from 10 to 15 cents for every gallon they produced. How long can you do that? Not too long. And you start slowing the plant down, or you shut the plant down. And in my job, I was made well aware of that because it got to be a real battle trying to buy DDGs for our feed mills. 1 week in particular around the holidays, I usually contact about 8 different plants getting prices and availabilities on DDGs. That week, 2 plants had product for sale. And since they knew that they were the only ones with product for sale, guess what their prices were like? DDG price of $185 a ton, and you could buy whole corn at $120. If you don't want it, don't take it. Somebody else will. It's kind of the attitude. They were trying to save some of their margins, salvage some of their margins because of the poor margins of ethanol. So what we have here, this is the line that we need to be at. These ethanol numbers, usage of corn reported every week. And we have to be at or above this red line to meet the current USDA projection, now lowered to 5.6 billion bushel in that December report. And you can see, look where we've been about the last 2 months. Are we on pace to make the number? Not right now. Now, we are seeing a little bit of relief because since Christmas Eve, we've seen the price of crude oil rally back up into the low $50 per barrel, up around that $51, $52 per barrel. So as we look at an ethanol margin recap here, here's a break even on this black line. Here were the ugly times when things were really wicked in the industry, but now we've actually come up to where we're pretty close to a break even. Some real efficient plants may be making a couple cents, some inefficient ones may be losing a couple, but we're closer to being par value. If you've noticed, some of you noticed that have possibly have done business with ethanol plants directly, they're probably not calling you up offering you big price premiums to buy corn these days. They've slowed the grind down, and because of margins, they really don't have as much to play with. Make sense? World. Now, when we talk about ending stocks in the world, we have to switch to the metric system, just like South American crops. So we're talking million metric ton. Anybody remember back in the 60s, if you were in school and in math class, what did they try and teach us all? Metric system, right? What's a liter? What's a centimeter? What's a millimeter? And because we were going to be using the metric system by what? 1970? What year is it this year? We're still the same, right? But the world stayed metric. So when we talk about this, just look at the trends. In December, ending stocks of corn 308, now projected at 307. Soybeans 115 down to 114. So the trade is thinking stocks are a little bit smaller. There's a chart that if we look at the trend for ending stocks of world corn, we see the trend is basically the same as what we're seeing in the U.S., where this would be now the third consecutive year where ending stocks are gradually working lower, meaning demand is greater than our production. And this, once again, supports prices. So I look at this and I seen this chart and I thought, boy, I just like the way this lays it out because it really puts things in perspective. So out of that 307 million metric ton ending stock number for the entire world, are you aware that 207 million metric ton is held by China? And 45 million metric ton by the U.S. So if you want corn in the world, the ending stocks of corn in the world are held by two countries, U.S. and China. And what do we know about this? Is it available to the rest of the world? Not really. Very, very few times will China export corn. What else do we suspect about this corn? It's probably not the best quality because some of it's been in storage for close to 10 years. Now, from a price standpoint, if China were to ignore the tariff, which if the government of China buys U.S. corn or soybeans to replenish reserve stocks, it is exempt from the 25% tariff. And if they look at that, they can buy U.S. corn out of the Gulf 50 to 60 cents a bushel cheaper than what they can buy it out of their own government reserves. So from an economic standpoint, it works. And there are rumors out there that China is considering buying U.S. corn. Now, you say, well, that don't make any sense. Today the market's down 7 cents. Well, today we're looking at the other side. We're not believing it, but it could happen. Interesting chart, I think. You know, just remember, U.S. and China hold the world stocks. Out of that 307, majority of it's in China. Of course, if the world wants corn, they know they can get it out of the U.S. 24/7, right? What about beans? Nice chart on U.S. stocks, world stocks, where the carryout's coming down. But remember what the U.S. carryout looked like on beans, and the world carryout is doing what? Same thing. Everybody in the world was trying to raise more and more soybeans to meet the ever-growing Chinese demand. That was never going to slow down, right? And then all of a sudden this year, China not only taps on the brakes, but they kind of slammed on the brakes. Remember, if we would have looked at this a year ago, USDA projection for bean imports of China were probably 100 to 103 million metric ton. And China just reported that last year they only used 83. What did they do? Well, according to them, they changed the percentage of their rations, less protein. They used alternatives like canola meal. And now they've got a situation going on where they've got less piggies to feed because a report this morning that said what's been officially reported or counted so far, the loss of 916,000 head of hogs in China. to this swine fever. Who's holding the beans in the world? Well, it's a different game. We see China holding about 19 million metric ton of beans, which is basically one crop for them. They raise about 16 million metric ton of soybeans in China. The big holder of beans in the world is Argentina, 41 million metric ton out of the 115. Why does Argentina continue to hold beans? High inflation rates, high export tax. It's been going on for years. You can see about 21 in Brazil, 25 in the US. So basically, the beans are not only raised in the Americas, the ending stocks are also held by both of the Americas. And then we get to China. Here's a map of China. Kind of looks like the country of China has measles, doesn't it? These red dots reflect confirmed outbreaks of the swine fever. And I just seen another map of this morning, an updated one. They're not getting to be less, they're getting to be more. Is it a regional or isolated area? It's all over. How did the thing spread so fast? We really don't know, but we do know when it first started, the outbreak started, there was a truckload of hogs taken off a farm up in this area, transported to a packing plant only 1,500 miles away. So you drug diseased hogs 1,500 miles across basically the entire country. And it's all over. We don't know how big it is. We don't know when it's going to stop. They say there's no vaccine. The industry right now estimates approximately at minimum of a 15% loss in protein demand because of the hogs. Some of the other things that we've heard, that the official government policy of China says if you report an outbreak on your farm, you are not supposed to raise hogs on that farm for 2 years. Now, keep in mind, I think a little over 40% of the hogs in China are on very small farms. So if you're a small mom and pop family in China and you have your 1.5 to 2 acres of corn, some vegetables, and a few hogs that run around, and one dies, are you going to report it to the government? Because if you report it to the government, what are they going to come and do with the rest of your pigs, whether they're sick or not? They're going to kill them to try and stop the spread of disease. So, you know, the Chinese government is well aware that a lot of these things probably aren't going to get reported. It makes it very hard to control. The other thing about it, we thought this, the trade thought a lot of this was on smaller operations until about a week ago an outbreak was reported on a farm that had 73,906 head of hogs on it. Big deal, right? So, this is a concern not only for the U.S., but for the world, because this is shrinking demand for protein and soybeans to your number one customer in the world. And we got a little bit of confirmation of that yesterday. This looks at Chinese monthly bean imports. This is from all parties, both South and North America, Argentina, Brazil, U.S. And the last 4 years are right here, and here's the current year. This month of December is down 40% from a year ago. That's a big deal. Now, the offset of that is, if they're losing that many hogs, the Chinese people may be concerned about pork raised in their own country, but they feel very comfortable with pork imported from America. It's why China bought Smithfield Foods. And if you go into a Chinese supermarket today, you will see a section in their meat counter that has made or raised in America with the Smithfield label. They're not going to let their people starve, right? And if they need to import pork because of lost production, because of the disease, because the people don't want to eat Chinese pork, they've got two choices. European Union and the U.S. And this, we can see, this type of news put about $10 onto hog futures, which all of a sudden makes the outlook for the U.S. pork industry a little bit better for the coming year, right? Last year we exported close to 24% of our pork, and we know our industry continues to grow, so we can offset some of that lost demand by possibly making more meat in this country and exporting it. We'll have to wait and see. There was a gentleman at our meeting yesterday that said, have you heard that they've found this swine fever in Europe? Now, I did a little bit of research on that, and I think it's true, but it was probably in a wild boar in Poland. So it wasn't necessarily in a livestock farm, but still, and actually that's where the disease first started years ago. So think of that, if all of a sudden China says we need to buy pork and we need to buy pork from the U.S. Arlen Sutterman is an analyst for INTL FC Stone. Jim and I have been at meetings with Arlen, and very down to earth, very intelligent person, very conservative. Following the meetings last week between the U.S. and China, in China, this is what Arlen reported. And keep in mind, INTL FC Stone has at least one, if not two, brokerage offices in China. So they have what they consider boots on the ground, or people in the country talking to people and traders who actually work with this stuff. They're convinced that China is on the verge of possibly buying anywhere from 8 to 12 million metric ton of corn from the U.S. Is that in the marketplace? Would that be a surprise to the marketplace? Let's take a middle of the road and say 10 million metric ton. There's roughly 39 million bushel in each million metric ton. So this would be about 400 million bushel. If we in fact did this business, what would happen to our carryout of 1.7 billion? And that's why this market is very volatile, because coming out of this report, this was common news a week ago. And then they wait for confirmation, and they wait for confirmation. And after about 3 days, they say, well, this must not be true, and the market liquidates. But with the government being shut down, do we know if China's bought any corn? They agree that protein demand probably down minimum of 15% because of swine flu. Here's a chart that goes way back into the 70s for corn imports by China. And the red bars are corn imports out of the U.S. See, we used to be a pretty good supplier of corn to China before they started raising more and before we got about to the year 2000. And when we went into this low period of corn exports, what was the reason for that? What did we do, or what changed? What did we start seeing come into American corn production about this time? The use of what? GMOs. And China came out and said, we're not going to buy GMO corn. Our kids will have 3 arms, 4 legs, and 2 heads. That was a joke. It hasn't happened in the U.S., has it? What did China announce last week? That they would accept what? GMO corn out of America. Once again, we haven't seen any purchases yet. But it just almost feels like the groundwork is there where something may be coming down the road. You see, if we look at the recent years here, these blue bars are corn imports from others. So for the last 10 years, China has been doing what? Importing corn. But not from us, to a large degree. What about the crop in South America? A couple things to point out. We know that last year Argentina had a very serious drought, the worst drought in probably the country's history. Their corn crop was 32 million metric ton, projected at 42 this year. A lot of this, same acres, just better weather. On soybeans, 37 last year, 55 this year. Once again, it's pretty much weather. But what about Brazil? Well, last year's corn 82, this year 94. So when we combine the corn out of South America, this is assuming a good crop for their summer corn or safrinha crop, which is yet to be planted. But if they have good results with that, Brazil and Argentina will have more corn available than they had a year ago, and this will start being competitive to the U.S. late summer. So once again, if we're going to beef up our corn exports in the U.S., we got to start doing it relatively soon, because we could run into more competition at the end of the summer. That also may say something to you as far as what your ideas are on basis for your corn that you might be holding. What about beans? Well, 122 was the USDA crop estimate for Brazil soybean production in December. Now the trade thinking it's down to about 120, but the range is anywhere from 116 to 122. And really it comes down to which day you're taking these estimates in bean production. There are people that say certain parts of Brazil are so critical right now that literally every day that they do not receive rain, the crop probably shrinks in that area. And you've got a wide range of estimates right now today. Now, CONAB is an agency in Brazil that, kind of like our USDA does regular crop estimates. Here's their corn estimate, and from December to January for Brazilian corn, they left it unchanged, and history tells us that that's pretty typical that they do that, and really it can go up or down from there depending on weather for that summer crop. But on soybeans, this year they just last week lowered their Brazilian soybean number from 120.1 to 118.8. There's only been 2 other times where they lowered that number from December to January, and in both cases, the final Brazilian bean number ended up smaller than this January estimate. So I'm in a camp right now where I think that crop is below 118. If we look at it, it would be quite a change. It was projected at 122 in December, 120 last year. If this thing comes down to 116 to 118, not necessarily bullish, but makes it probably a little less bearish for the bean complex. Dr. Michael Cordonnier, if some of you may remember, I think it was 12 or 13 years ago, New Vision brought this speaker into Worthington Memorial Auditorium. And he spoke an afternoon, a very, very interesting individual, married to a Brazilian gal. They live down there for most of the year, and then he also comes up and works out of an office in Chicago. He writes a corn and soybean newsletter that pretty much focuses on Brazil and Argentina production. This was from his newsletter last week. Most optimistic estimates have the Brazilian bean crop down 5% from a year ago. He thinks the crop is approximately no better than 114 million metric ton. That would be down from 120 a year ago. That would be somewhat supportive. The most pessimistic have it down 20%, which would take the crop down to 96. He's not saying that's going to happen, but if it did, it would be a game changer, wouldn't it? We don't think there's that much damage right now, but we also don't think we're talking a crop equal to last year's crop anymore. From a vegetative standpoint, I don't understand how they analyze these maps, but this compares last year to this year in January. And the areas of concern are northeast Brazil, where you see these little red dots. You can see it actually was drier in those areas a year ago than it is now, but they still say significant crop damage and stress in these areas up here. And if you go to southern Brazil into Argentina, you see all this blue where it's basically been too wet. So you've got too much rain in Brazil, not enough rain in some parts of too much rain in Argentina, not enough in some parts of Brazil, causing some pressure on the yields in both countries. AgRoyal is a company that Danny and I know an individual that works there. She used to come in and do crop tours here, and she'd ask Danny and I to take her out into fields to show her Minnesota production. You know what? It's kind of interesting. The first time she was here, you know the thing that fascinated her the most? Were all of our paved roads. Because she said in Brazil everything is clay, and when it rains it turns to mud. And she was amazed that there were paved roads out amongst our fields. Anyway, we know Danielle. She hasn't come up here the last couple of years because the Minnesota crops have been too good. And she said her company wouldn't fund the money for her to travel up here because if she took pictures of the Minnesota crop and took it back to show to her customers, they would be depressed. So her company, AgRoyal, last week lowered their production number on Brazil from 119 to 116. I really think that 114 to 116 is probably what the market, probably where the crop is right now. Whether the market's trading that today or not, we're not sure. Now, when we finally bring these production estimates into the balance table for Brazil, we see comparing production from last year to this year projected to raise more corn. And if they raise more corn, they probably will also export more corn and be competitive against the U.S. But if we see this crop start shrinking down from last year's number, we also see that their bean exports probably will be reduced, and that possibly gives the U.S. a little more chance of getting some exports on as we go down the road, all subject to what demand is in China. Now, when we look at weather, here's what I was talking about earlier, and based on previous conditions, this is from CWG, Commodity Weather Group, and they're giving a hint of what they see happening here for the spring of 2019 and the summer of 2019. These blues and light blues are basically normal to cooler than normal temperatures, and when you have these yellow areas, drier conditions, a little bit drier than normal. So for spring, they're kind of looking at cool and dry on the northern plains. Should be relatively good conditions as far as getting the crop in. And as they look to the summer, they see temperatures pretty close to normal, but all of this yellow, they anticipate a drier pattern. So when we get that type of news through the growing season, that probably means there's going to be opportunities, right? May not threaten the crop, may not hurt the crop, but we'll give ourselves a chance to get some marketing done. Okay, then before we go here, I gotta share a little story with you. You need to kind of liven up a little bit anyway, don't you? Okay. Anybody ever watch westerns years ago when you were growing up? You know, cowboys? You know, you ever see one of these where a young stud cowboy, you know, would be out on a cattle drive and he'd come to town? Where's the first place he went? Well, no, the saloon. We're going to keep it clean. We're going to go to the saloon.
Same difference.
And he buys a jug of whiskey. And he's drinking it down and feeling pretty smart. And he's got a fancy 6-shooter in his holster. He goes outside the saloon and he sees this little old gal riding up on a mule. You've probably seen those westerns, haven't you? One of these old crusty mountain girls, you know, just come to town once in a while. And he walks out there, she gets off the mule, and he walks up to her and he said, "Old lady, would you like to dance?" And she said, "Young man, I never danced and never wanted to." And he says, "Well, you're going to dance now." And he takes his 6-shooter out and starts shooting at the dirt underneath her feet. And what did she do? Well, she danced to keep from getting her toes shot off. And he empties his gun, and he's laughing, and by this time in this small western town, the locals have gathered around, and they're all laughing because they know this old hill gal, and she's just, you know, not one of them, and they're all thinking it's pretty funny. And the old guy takes his bottle of whiskey, and he starts heading back into the saloon. And all of a sudden it gets quiet. And all he hears is this click. And then he hears another click. And he turns around, and that old lady's got a double-barrel shotgun aimed right at his head. And the place is quiet. And the old lady says, "Young man, have you ever kissed the behind of a mule?" And he said, "No, but I think I want to." Funny story, but we're going to look at some life lessons that we can gather out of that story from this young cowboy. First of all, never be arrogant, right? Was this young cowboy arrogant? Don't waste ammunition. When he had that double-barrel shotgun pointing at him, his gun was empty. So you always want to save a bullet or two for something that might happen in the markets, right? China buys corn, market's going to react. China doesn't buy corn, Brazil has a big crop, market's going to react. Whiskey makes you think you're smarter than you are. Can anybody attest to that? Back in our teenage years, right? Always make sure you know who has the power. That's the main reason I put this story in here. Who has the power in the markets? He who has what? The money. Jerry Maguire, show me the money. So sometimes we can look at all this information, all these fundamentals, and the market might do something totally different because the money wants to go a different direction. And then finally, don't mess with old people. They didn't get old by being stupid. Right? Now, I'm not jabbing old people because I'm getting there pretty close too. Was up watching my grandson play basketball this weekend, and we were talking to our daughter about some things. She works for Edward Jones, and she's trying to get Dad to get a retirement plan together, you know, which I don't know. Anyway, we're talking about things, and Cody looks up and says, "Grandpa, Just how old are you? Gotta love them, right? Jim had a senior moment yesterday. Yeah. When we got to Wilmot to do the producer meeting, and I said, "Where's the projector?" And he said, "I thought you had it." So we just had Nate run it up to Brewster. We were just a few minutes late, but that's okay, right? Better to be old than the alternative. So who has the money? Who has the power? As of yesterday's report, the commodity funds, or the money crowd, which we're going to call along, about 120,000 contracts of corn. So if you kind of gathered that I am kind of friendly to the corn market, I think there's something that's going to happen to give us good opportunity on corn. The money or the funds are saying they probably think the same thing. They really don't want to be short corn right now, right? And if you're a user of corn for livestock, I'd have my corn covered. I see more risk to the upside than the downside right now on corn. Not a blow-off type market, but just a grinder that keeps working higher. What about beans? As of yesterday, they're basically even. Now, if you go back and look at the previous meetings we've had over the last 6 to 8 months, if I remember right, they've been short beans for a long time and a pretty significant short. So even though the fundamentals look pretty negative right now, the funds are also saying on beans, maybe we've tried to beat this market down. And yeah, we go up and down, we got volatility, but we're just not making new lows. So maybe it's time to be closer to even rather than short beans. I don't know what they do longer term, because when you look at the numbers, we got to be real careful on beans, right? Nearby corn chart, continuation chart, keeps rolling ahead between each month. What do we see here? Well, first of all, if we go back to last July and look where we're at today, corn market's been an uptrend since last summer. Now, I didn't say we had good prices, but we have been working higher. Like Jim said, we're 30 cents higher than where we were a year ago. In October and November, we tested our old highs around 378, 379. December, we went up to 386. January so far, 384. We still have a gap open on this continuation chart up to 390 and 3/4. Gaps are meant to be filled. I believe that for years. I think at some point in time, we are going to possibly work a little bit higher, fill this gap, maybe go up and test some of these other areas around $4. It's been a long time since nearby corn has traded above $4 in Chicago. Now, if and when we get that opportunity, what do you want to do? Better sell. Don't go buy corn at that point. Don't go buy call options. A lot of these rumors that we're talking about with China, we've seen it time and time again over the last month. Buy the rumor, sell the fact. But it just feels like corn can work a little bit higher. RSI, or Relative Strength Index, the end of last week, right around 50, so pretty much mid-range. What we notice, or what you want to follow on this RSI, when the RSI gets up into the 70 to 80 percentile, the market is overbought and probably due for a correction back down. Not necessarily a collapse, but a correction. If the market is down, the RSI is down in this lower area, 20, 15, don't sell even if I tell you to sell, because the market's oversold and probably going to bounce or recover. When we look at May corn futures, go back for the last 6 years, just kind of put this in perspective. We can see 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, very low prices. And very tight range in the past year, only 38-cent range from high to low. That's extremely tight on corn. So my point being, I think we're going to break out of this tight range on corn. I want it to be to the upside. And right now, I think the fundamentals kind of support that. What about new crop corn? Here's a monthly chart for December corn futures in Chicago. I want to point out a few things here. First of all, let's look at prices. And in 2017, our high was 417. Last year, 429. But if you go back for the last 12 years, you see that almost every year, you're able to sell December corn futures in around that 425 area. And most years, close to 450. But this is a monthly chart, so each line is 1 month. when we get to these tops, whether it's 429 or 449 or 454, how long does it last? Maybe a day. This is a monthly chart, but that means that it could have happened once in that month. So how do you capture that type of thing? You have the orders in, right? And here's the other thing to keep in mind, I think that we'll look at on this chart. This looks at December corn futures for the last 8 years. When are your prices always the lowest on December corn? Here's your calendar right down here. When are they the lowest? Harvest. Guys, we need to keep marketing simple, right? If we look at this and it's black on white or colors showing that our lowest prices are always at harvest, when do we want to avoid selling anything? At harvest. So now let's look at when we should look to sell. And if we look at the calendar here we are in January right now. Here's March, here's May. You know, it tells us that each and every year, now 2012 was a drought, so that's a little bit different, but that did go higher after that. But almost every year, when we get to about the 1st of July, what happens to the corn market? It starts grinding lower right into harvest. So if there are bushels we know that we can't hold in an average year, that we need to market, we need to do it in the window that we're in right here, right? About January to May, possibly into the 3rd week of June. Jim's going to be talking about a program that New Vision has available now that kind of looks into taking advantage of pricing during these times like this. What about daily continuation on beans? Well, we've been bumping up against resistance around this 925, 930 area. This last time we made it up to 915. Today now I think we've taken out some support. If you kind of draw some lines up here, we have been in an uptrend on beans also, and we're kind of getting down to the point now today where we're bumping up against that channel line. Technically that's not good if we take that out, but we'll see if we get some new news. You know, the market is just kind of sideways and looking for directions. When we get some positive feelings out of the China agreement, we go higher, and then we get disappointed if we don't get confirmation. So not a lot of direction here. When we look at the fundamentals, the bean market has got a lot of hard work to do to work towards higher prices. RSI on beans also right around 50, so kind of mid-range. When we look at the May bean chart like we did on corn, we also see the low prices, and we also see a narrow range, only 92 cents from high to low so far this year on this contract. That's extremely tight for beans. So, you know, we could also break out of that range on beans, but right now the fundamentals make it probably a little more difficult to go to the upside. What about monthly chart of November beans for new crop? Now this is something that kind of boggles my mind, and I think it boggles a lot of traders' minds. If we have this many beans in the U.S. to carry over and in the world, remember on the nearby bean chart, we are trading 915 on that previous chart. Why are we at 950 for new crop beans in Chicago? That's really encouraging the farmer to do what? Well, to sell or to at least plant beans this year again, right? But do we really need the beans? So I'm fine with producers keeping their rotation and planting beans, but with the fundamentals that we're looking at, you got to watch pretty closely and have some protection maybe on those beans, right? November beans, similar, somewhat similar, but not quite as definite pattern as December corn. But you see once again, lowest prices, even in the years with drought, come at harvest. That's a no-brainer really. And really, your best price opportunities usually still come here prior to July. So we're into that window right now where we can make that work. Okay, a little bit about possibly what might be coming down the road. You know, eventually we'll get this final production report from the USDA. Eventually we'll get the grain stocks, updated supply and demand tables, and before long, we're up to March 31st, our planning intentions report, right? I think this could be a real interesting report this year. what have you heard a lot of talk about, and what do you think? What is the trade thinking right now as far as what the American farmer is going to plant this year? What have you heard? More corn. No brainer, right? Well, what are economics saying? This chart looks at the comparison of November bean futures and December corn futures. And as of last Friday, that ratio, if you divide your November bean price by your December corn price, it came out to 2.37. Based on that ratio, what is the market telling the American farmer to plant more of? As it gets closer to 2.5, the market's telling you to plant more beans. You see, if the market was really enticing the American farmer to plant corn, this ratio should be down to about 2.25. So what needs to happen here? Well, maybe December corn has to start going up faster than November beans. That would correct the ratio. But the other thing that could happen here, farmers that were thinking of planting more corn may say what? Going to stick with beans because inputs are, doggone Weber, I keep telling them, you're charging too much for your fertilizer. That's why these guys can't make money. So that's strike one against more corn acres. And I believe the market really believes that today. They may be in for a surprise in March. And then we see an article like this talking about the higher input costs, seed corn up, fertilizer up, everything's up. And when you look at how it really works, most farms may say, just going to keep the rotation unchanged. And I don't have a problem with that, but when we look at this bean situation, if our carryout would grow to 1 billion bushel and the American farmer plants the same amount of beans, what might that carryout be a year from now? 1.4, 1.5 billion? We're not talking corn carryout, we're talking beans. So I'm fine with doing that, but you might want to have a marketing plan to get some protection on that beans if you're going to go that route. One other thing, 2 slides on wheat. Right now the trade believes about 32.2 million acres of winter wheat planted. If we look at a chart showing a historical perspective, how does that compare to history? Smallest wheat number we've planted since the 70s. What happened? Wheat prices have actually been a little stronger than a year ago. In fact, earlier I suppose it was late summer, early fall, Kansas City wheat is usually what they'll market their winter wheat off of, and I think they had opportunities to hedge $6 plus Kansas City futures. That should have increased wheat acres, and the market thought we were going to do that. What was one of the reasons why this winter wheat acres number stayed lower? Remember what I was talking about Kansas? If you couldn't get your beans harvested because it was too wet, what else did that prevent you from doing? Planting winter wheat. Now, are they going to leave these acres just sit, or are they going to plant something else? They're going to plant something else, right? So it's an unknown, but we'll have to wait and see. So what should you do? The basis is a regulator on corn and beans to kind of keep the farmer selling in tune, in check with the demand in the marketplace. How many of you guys want to sell grain today? Come on. We use grain every day. Feed mills grind, ethanols grind, exports. But you see, if the farmer doesn't want to sell, then the basis probably has to do a little bit more work to meet that demand, to source grain. And I asked Jim about the price of corn, and he said it's 30 cents higher than a year ago. How does this year's basis compare to a year ago?
10 to 15 cents narrower.
Think about that. If we had a record corn crop in the U.S., what would you expect our basis to be comparing this year to last year? So is the crop there? Don't know. Watch Commodity Fund, watch the money. They're long corn. They're basically even beans right now. Average prices, this is from the December report, average of 360, range of 325 to 395. What we recommend in our marketing plans is when you can lock in this average price, you start selling some. And if and when the market rallies higher into the upper end of this range, you become more aggressive. And when you get to 395, you don't call Jim up and say, what do you really think I should do? Right?
That's right.
Because at that point, you should probably be sold out, bullets empty on your gun, and now you're starting to hunt for the next new crop, right? Beans, 785 to 935, average of 860, same type of mindset there. This is what we want to target as our starting point if we get that opportunity, and then more aggressive as the market works higher. Keep an eye on China news, U.S.-China trade, China swine fever, big thing, China demand, big thing, China corn purchases. I think at some point we're going to see some. I think we could see more soybean sales to China. I think China could buy U.S. ethanol. Just today I read an article that first time in over 6 months where China bought 3 shiploads of U.S. crude oil. I really think the walls are starting to crack on this no U.S. products, and I think we are going to get something done. South American grain production, keep an eye on that. The El Nino giving us good weather up here during our winter so far, creating some stress in South America. Respect and reward rallies. And don't get too bullish at the wrong time. When cake is passed, take cake, right? Because when the plate's empty, then you're out of luck. Closing bid page from yesterday. So what can we get out of this thing as far as market ideas? What's the market telling us to do? Market's pretty flat on the near term, all the way out to spring, really. If you have farm storage, there's still a little bit of carry out to the end of next summer. Oh my gosh, look at this. Now this is yesterday's close. I apologize if we were lower today. But as of yesterday's close, this 356 area for next August is pretty close to what? That average price of 360. And if we were to get something going on with corn yield whenever that report comes out, if China comes in and buys a little bit of corn, something like that, could this market work a little bit higher and get us up to maybe 370, 375, higher up into that range? Yeah, I think that possibility is there. Today it doesn't look that way, but we'll get chances. As far as next year, 352 off the combine. But you can see there's already carries developing into next year. So as you go to make new crop sales, if you have farm storage for bushels that you aren't going to sell, once again the market's probably telling you to sell the carry. Look to price higher prices out into here. What about beans? 818 for spot beans. The market is really telling you we don't want or need your beans today, aren't they? But what is the market telling you to do if you have farm stored beans? A 30-cent carry out to next August. Now granted, interest rates are creeping up a little bit, so it costs you a little bit more to keep those beans off the market, but a 30-cent carry probably still works for this storage hedge if you have beans on the farm. And for next new crop, 862 off the combine, you can see a nice carry into the 2020. Can you believe that we're talking about 2020? I thought the world was going to end in the year 2000. Unbelievable how fast time goes, isn't it? Jim, do you want to talk a little bit about your oh wait. Had to keep it a little bit light. This old gal's got problems. This ever happen on your farm? I put this in just to remind myself that a friend of mine called up. When I was talking to him, he said, what are you doing next week? I said, I've got farmer meetings. He said, make sure you tell your farmers about the years that end in 9. Okay, help me. What about years that end in 9? Cattle futures always are higher at the end of the year than the beginning of the year. So sell beans and buy cattle. No, I'm not telling you to do that. But if you have cattle, that's a possibility. Oh, seasonals. I'm sorry. I made you stand up too soon.
Yes.
Have a chair. Have a chair. This leads into what Jim's going to talk about as far as the pool contract that New Vision is offering. And what this looks at is what we call price seasonals. Now what we have here in the blue line, this is corn on your left-hand side. This is a 3-year seasonal. In other words, this is what the price of corn has done from the start of our crop year in September to the end in August 31st. 3-year in blue, 5-year in black. This is the current year. Do seasonals tend to follow the same pattern? Boy, it looks like it, doesn't it? And it really looks like it this year, the way we're following this 5-year. And if this, in fact, follows the same pattern, see, I'm not that smart. I just use the market information. The market's telling me that if I own corn here today, what should I do? Be patient. You're going to get an opportunity. But once you get past about the 3rd week of June, what happens in the 3-year? What happens in the 5-year? So we don't want to fall in love with our corn saying, I'm just going to wait until the 4th of July because it might get dry. We haven't pollinated the crop yet. You haven't heard that, have you? What New Vision's pool program is going to do is they're going to look at this time right in here when the market says in the 3-year and the 5-year that is the what, is that the best or the worst time to sell? It's the best time to sell. And it's hard for us to do that because we get emotional, we see the crop outside, we hear about other reports, but if we're disciplined, this is probably the best time to try and sell our corn on the average. And then we see the same type of thing on beans on your right-hand side, the 3-year in blue, the 5-year in black, and the current year here. Not quite as exact as what we're seeing on corn this year, but still following the same type of trend. Okay, now Jim can talk. And then finally, the other thing we want to bring to your attention is what all you farmers had on your Christmas list, right? Free price later. You want to haul grain, but you don't want to sell it, right? That's what we hear. Opened up as of yesterday, correct? Terms are there if you have any questions, but that can be done anytime. This brings up another point. And New Vision offered this program, Free Price Later, because you, our customers and owners, have requested it. But I'll tell you something else that makes me question a little bit the crop in some areas. There was an elevator in central part of Nebraska that opened Free Price Later up in early December. One in northwest, north central Iowa that was open for Free Price Later in mid-November. Now, why would elevators open up that early just after harvest? What probably didn't happen during harvest? They didn't get filled. But the USDA says we had a record crop in all these states. And did you notice around the country that ground piles were a lot smaller or non-existent in a lot of cases? Just makes you really question it, doesn't it? Now, the yeah, but people will say, yeah, but you got to keep in mind harvest was extended, people had a chance to move it out. That's somewhat true, but just really question too. If we raised a crop that big, probably would have had more sitting around. Final thoughts for your consideration. I always believe in leaving you with something to kind of outside of marketing, right? More of a life type thing. You can remember the mule story for that side, but this is a little bit different than that. So always remember to do your best. That doesn't mean you have to be the best, right? God has given and blessed us each with talents, and if we use that to the best of our abilities, that's all we're expected to do. Pray that whatever you do is blessed. And a lot of that has to be with interacting with people in our lives, because that's really why we're here. We're not here to buy feed ingredients or sell grain or raise livestock. And then finally, in the end, let God do the rest. He's put us here. He promised to bless us, take care of us. And if we put our faith in Him, it's going to work out, right? So thank you for coming. Have a safe rest of the winter. And we look forward to working with you. And we'll see you again in a few months to hopefully go through a lot of report numbers.